Let's look at how a Silverlight application is put together. Let's do File, New Project in Visual Studio. And let's create a project which we'll call Anatomy. For the anatomy of a Silverlight application, let's click OK. And we'll talk about the Visual Studio environment in a different video, so all I'm going to do here is click OK and say yes. And our Silverlight application, for the purposes of this video, will be a very simple thing. All we'll do is put into our piece of XAML a button, and we'll just go ahead and give that a margin of 5. We'll give it some content which says click me, and we'll say click equals on click to add an event handler. Let's let the display refresh to show that button, and let's go to the code that lives behind this, and we'll implement an event handler. We'll say event handler on click, and all we will do is grab the sender as though it was a button, which it will be, and we'll just set its content to be thanks. And so if we go ahead and press F5 now, we should have a working application. Let's just switch on debugging. We should have a working application where we can click this and it says thanks. So we've built an application. The question is, what is it that we actually just built, and how does all this end up on the screen? So let's take this from the top. I'll come back and talk about the Visual Studio structure at a later point, so really I want to explain how the Silverlight bits work. But over here in our website, we've got a superfluous file, default.aspx. So I'm going to delete that for a second, just so it's out of our way. And then what we've got in the web project are two pages. We have an ASPX page and an HTML page. So let's start with the HTML page. If we look into the HTML page, then what the HTML page says is that we're going to use an object tag down here. And this object tag says that we're trying to instantiate a browser plugin called Silverlight. And so obviously you have to have that thing installed. And we're trying to load up Silverlight 2 Beta 2 application. So that's pretty simple to understand. One of the parameters into this object tag is the source of the application. And what we have here is client bin / anatomy / zap. And so that's fairly simple to understand. Again, the source of the application comes from this zap file. As it happens, inside of this object tag we have some alternate HTML to display for people who don't have the Silverlight plugin, and they will get this HTML displayed. So this is how we do this with an object tag. We've actually wrapped this up with an ASP.NET control, and so if we go to ASP.NET file over here, you'll see that in here we have a ASP.NET Silverlight control, which also points at the zap file. And naturally what this is going to do is ultimately generate the object tag, so it's a nicer way of generating the object tag. So why do we even give you this HTML file? Well, it might be that you're hosting on a web server that doesn't have ASP.NET, in which case you'd want to use the HTML mechanism. Otherwise you might well want to use the Silverlight control from ASP.NET. So that's how these things end up in the browser. Now, in terms of that zap file, where that comes from is from this folder here called client bin. So when the Silverlight application builds up here, it produces anatomy.zap. And if we go and open this with Windows Explorer, we'll see here is our anatomy.zap. We can copy this. Let's just paste. I'll rename that to be .zip, and we'll find that this is actually just a zip file. And if we go ahead and zoom into that zip file, we'll find a few things in there. Specifically, we've got anatomy.dll. So anatomy.dll is the code that we wrote. That's our .NET MSIL assembly. And then we've got this manifest.xaml file. Let's open that up with Notepad, if we can open that up with Notepad. And we can see in here that we have a deployment section, and what we've got is an assembly that contains our entry point. Our assembly is called anatomy. The entry point type is called anatomy.app. So this is where the application is going to start running. And we can see the application is made up of a number of parts, in our case only one, and that part is called anatomy, and it comes from anatomy.dll. So hopefully you're starting to piece this together. The framework, the plugin, is going to look for anatomy.dll. It's going to launch into that and look for this class called anatomy.app. So let's close this file down. Let's come back out of this zip file. In fact, let's delete the zip file. We're never going to need that because we've got the zap file. So that gets us there. Up here what we've got is our Silverlight application. So let's take a look at the Silverlight application. If we look at this right now, we've got two sort of files in here, it seems. we've got app.xaml. If we take a look at app.xaml, this is just an XML file, a XAML file, which combines with some other code to produce anatomy.app. And that, if you remember, is the start point for our application. Where does the rest of this file come from? Well, it comes from the code behind, which is app.xaml.cs. And if we look into that file, we'll see that this is part of a partial class called app. Similarly, so is this, as you can see here. And so both of those things ultimately derive from a framework class called application. There are three events that this class syncs on that class: the startup event, the exit event, and the unhandled exception event. It then calls out to a function called initialize component, which is what ties this class together with its XAML class back here. We won't look at that here, but we'll look at it in a second in a similar vein with the page class. Again, what happens in the startup code here, when we look at the startup code, what we do is we say the root visual for the application, that is the core of the UI, the thing on the screen, the root of the tree that's on the screen, is assigned to a new instance of a class called page. Okay, so let's close these two things down and let's go take a look at page, because over here we have page.xaml, and once again, if we look at this in XAML mode, page.xaml says it's a user control which producing a class called anatomy.page. And what it's doing is it's putting a grid on there that's called layout root and a button on there which doesn't have a name. And it's contributing this to part of a partial class, and once again the rest of that partial class is coming from this code behind here. And we can see in this code behind we are completing a partial class called page, or anatomy.page, which again of course derives from user control. And again we got this call to initialize component here. If you go and have a look at that initialize component, let's just go to the definition of that. This is in generated code. You can see page.g.c# up here. And what you'll spot is that initialize component is going ahead and it's loading the page.xaml file that we just saw. And then what it's done in our case, because we had a specific grid over here which had a name of layout root, then what the generated code has done is it's generated a member variable of type grid called layout root, and in initialize component here it sets that up to point to the grid that it finds in the UI with the name layout root. And so that's how our member variable ultimately gets tied to that thing that came from the XAML. So we're putting together the XAML, which has some code generated from it, and the C# all at one place to give us that member variable called layout root. So there's just one thing we didn't explain there. How did this page.xaml end up as an embedded resource in the output assembly? Well, if we were to just explore this a little bit further, let's go to the bin folder where we can actually see anatomy.dll. So let's go ahead and open that in Windows Explorer, and let's take that assembly and drop it into the reflector tool. So let me just go to reflector over here, and here we have anatomy.dll inside of reflector, and you can see that there are resources, and if we look into those resources you can see that we have page.xaml and app.xaml. So the compiler is actually embedding these things as resources into the output assembly so that they end up inside of anatomy.dll, if you like, my assembly for my Silverlight application. So hopefully you can see how these things are coming to be inside there such that the generated code can go and load that up. So just following that through one more time, we start off with the HTML page. It has an object tag. The object tag tells the browser to instantiate Silverlight. The source parameter tells it that we're using this zap file. We know that inside of the zap file there is a manifest that describes the application and tells it which class to start with, and also our assembly and any other assemblies that need to be deployed with it. We know that the application XAML and the associated code will cause us to have a class that forms the startup of the application, and when that code runs we know that it will create an instance of page, and page comes from this XAML file along with this C# file, and that's really where our UI is created and how things end up on the screen.